While Paul was waiting for visiting hours to see his friend Dennis, who was hospitalized due to a high fever, he was flipping through some old magazines to pass the time. At a certain moment, an elderly man sat next to him. Paul noticed that he was wearing clothes that seemed to belong to patients, so he assumed the man was also hospitalized and taking a stroll around the hospital to distract himself. "Are you waiting for someone?" the man asked, smiling. "Yes, an old friend, almost like a brother, who is hospitalized but doing much better and will be discharged in about 2 days," Paul replied. "Could you do me a big favor?" the man asked softly. Paul looked at him somewhat awkwardly, as he imagined the friendly old man would ask him for something different to eat or, worse, a hidden cigarette. "Well, it depends on what it is, but I can help," Paul said. "Tomorrow, someone named Dora will come looking for me, but I won't be here. I would like to surprise her and not make her worry," said the old man, smiling. Paul didn't quite understand, but he thought it might be a joke or a game to surprise this person when he returned home. "Well, tomorrow I'll definitely be here, especially with the expectation of my friend being discharged. What do you want me to tell her?" Paul asked. The old man, very pleased with Paul's willingness to help, said, "Her name is Dora. She's my wife. She's short, and she'll definitely have her hair tied in a braid. She has a small scar on her forehead and will be carrying a small, flowery umbrella in red and blue. It's a gift from me," the old man chuckled. "Tell her that at the right moment, I'll be waiting for her under our tree at the ranch in Texas. The ranch is called Rosa Azul. She'll understand," he said. Paul found the story interesting and was starting to enjoy being part of a romantic tale of a couple who seemed to have been together for decades and would surely celebrate the old man's return. He then asked for the man's name. "My name is Billy, but few people know me by that name. If you ask for Bill, they'll surely know," the old man said while we laughed at our simple conversation. At that moment, a woman dressed like a nurse appeared. She approached us with a smile and said, "Mr. Billy, shall we go? It's time." The old man discreetly looked at me and winked. I discreetly winked back as if to seal our agreement, but I noticed that the woman had noticed everything. She didn't say anything, just smiled, and they left. I stood there watching them move away when the visitation was finally allowed, and the news was good: his friend could go home the next day. I would come to pick him up and try to find Mrs. Dora. The next day, there was Paul, sitting in the same place, flipping through some old magazines, waiting for his friend to be discharged. He saw a lady approaching through the hallway. She was short, around 70 years old, with braided hair, and she carried a small, flowery umbrella in red and blue. Paul stood up immediately to make sure of the lady's description, which was confirmed when he noticed the small scar on her forehead. "Mrs. Dora?" Paul said politely. "Yes," she replied. At that moment, Paul could see that her eyes were red. It seemed she had been crying. But he had promised to deliver that favor to the old man. "I have a message for you," Paul said. "A message?" she asked, somewhat confused. "What message?" "A message from Bill. He asked me to." At that moment, the elderly woman's expression changed, and she became very nervous. "How can you joke about these things? Who are you? Why are you doing this?" she exclaimed. Paul, still not understanding, told her that he just wanted to pass on a message from Mr. Bill, which he had received yesterday. The lady became extremely nervous. She started crying and almost slapped Paul until she said, very agitated, that she would call security. Paul, getting desperate, could only say, "Rosa Azul. Rosa Azul Ranch, under your tree." At that moment, the lady stopped, fell silent, and looked at Paul in fear. "What did you say?" she asked, frightened. Paul then delivered the message that Mr. Bill had requested, about waiting for her at the right moment under the tree that belonged to them. At that moment, Mrs. Dora stopped and hugged Paul tightly. Paul, who was no longer understanding anything, asked her, "Mrs. Dora, what's happening?" She took him by the arm and led him to the chairs, where they sat down, and she began to speak. "I was very young when I met Bill. He worked for my father on the ranch. Gradually, we grew closer and started dating in secret because my family didn't approve. One afternoon, we were sitting under a jabuticaba tree, our tree. With a little stone, we drew a heart with our initials. That's when Bill told me, no matter what happens, no one will ever separate us, not even when one of us passes away and goes to the other side. The first one to go will wait here, under the jabuticaba tree, until the time of reunion. Even with my family against us, we got married. We had children, and over time, my father saw how good Bill was and accepted him as a son. We lived together for almost 60 years. Unfortunately, in recent years, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. It was very sad to see him gradually forgetting me until he fell into a coma. He was unconscious for 3 months, and every day I came to spend a little time with him, talking, reading, but I wasn't sure if he could hear me. Unfortunately, he passed away yesterday." Paul was simply speechless. He couldn't say anything. A tear ran down his cheek, which the lady wiped away. "Today, after what you told me, I'm sure he knew I would be here every day, that he somehow heard what I said, what I read to him. I have no words to thank you." As Mrs. Dora said her goodbyes and stood up to leave, Paul couldn't even say a word in farewell. He just stood there, watching. Then he felt a tap on his shoulder. It was his friend, telling him he was now free to go home and that he was hungry.